Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. I hope everyone had a great Labor Day weekend. If you're listening to this in anything close to real time. If not, I hope you revisit the memory of Labor Day weekend with joy. I took it pretty easy, to be honest. I chilled out, did a lot of reading, mainly for the show, but also for fun, which is what we call the extracurricular reading in my life. Now, once I get this episode up, though, I go into like heavy duty work mode. My big annual conference, which we're doing in person for the first time since 2019, is only 5 weeks away, and I've got a lot of planning and execution to do to pull that one off. But I feel pretty confident in my ability to pull everything together and not let everyone down. That said, one of my weekend projects involved going through a bunch of John le Carré novels that I'd read in the past to find lines that might help me build a thread through this thing that I'm writing. And I tell you this because one of the lines I came across from one of my dog-eared pages of A Perfect Spy was about Magnus Pym's various personae. And it goes, and I quote, "It's Pym, the Saturday night juggler, bounding round the table and spinning one stupid plate after another because he can't bear to let anyone down for 1 second and so lose their esteem." I'll admit, I felt seen. Not a spy, but, you know, I get everything else that's going on in that description. But I think I found what I need for that writing project if I can couple it with an idea that I will admit I find truly monstrous. And in fact, this conversation that we had kind of freed up my willingness to think about executing such a monstrous idea in prose. I'll let you know if it works out. So let's get to this week's show and that conversation. My guest this time is the author Jonathan Ames, who has a new book out today, The Wheel of Doll, from Mulholland Books. It's the second book in his hard-boiled crime series about a PI named Happy Doll. If you know anything about Ames's previous books and TV shows, you'll probably say, yeah, that tracks. Jonathan's a fantastic writer. He's got a deep love of crime fiction, as we talked about the last time he was on the show in 2018. That time he came to my house here in northern New Jersey because he grew up just a few miles away, and he was awfully glad to have the opportunity to just revisit his old stomping grounds, which he went off and did after we'd finished up. He had to call in from L.A. this time, but I'm hoping we get to go on a meander through Oakland together sometime. Or maybe just a hike at Ramapo Lake. We'll see. Anyway, The Wheel of Doll continues a story that Jonathan began in A Man Called Doll, which is out in paperback now, also from Mulholland. The first book introduces us to his down-on-his-luck private investigator and his life in L.A., where he used to be a cop. It also introduces us to Happy's dog, George, who holds a special place in his heart. Now, I don't want to give away anything about the plot of either book. I will just say Jonathan knows how to hit the beats of a detective novel. Like we talked about in 2018, he is a student of the greats, like Richard Stark and Richard Stark / Donald Westlake and Raymond Chandler. And like those guys, he knows how to take the genre and infuse it with his own sensibility to create a lead character and a world that'll draw you in. Each of the Doll books so far is around 200 pages, and you may find yourself devouring them in a single sitting, like I did. And both books are alternately funny, tense, a little violent, a little horrifying at times, especially the first one where I told Jonathan after that I felt a sort of claustrophobic dread when the real mechanism of the plot was laid bare. The plots themselves are compelling, but the story, who Happy Doll is and how he's trying to change and what his world does to people who are trying to escape it, to get off the cycle, I guess, that'll knock you out of the park. These are pretty remarkable novels. I enjoyed the heck out of A Man Called Doll, but with The Wheel of Doll, the new one, Jonathan really raises the bar, and it's clear to me he's building something special with these books. Anyway, that is all I'm going to tell you. I'm not going to give away anything about the plot, the characters, etc., all the things that really make the Doll series special. So just go read the Happy Doll novels from Mulholland Books by Jonathan Ames. Here's Jonathan's bio from the new book. Jonathan Ames is the author of several books, including Wake Up, Sir, and most recently, A Man Called Doll. His novels, The Extra Man and You Were Never Really Here, have been adapted into films, and he's the creator of 2 television series, Blunt Talk and Bored to Death. His new book is The Wheel of Doll. And now, the 2022 Virtual Memories Conversation with Jonathan Ames. So it's been about 4.5 years since we got together, and you've turned to a life of crime, it looks like?
Well,
or a life of crime writing?
Well, 4.5 years ago when we met, which also is kind of stunning. I mean, this time of COVID has done something so strange and interesting to time. And I mean, time is always kind of maddening and odd, but anyway, so when we met 4.5 years ago, we were meeting to talk about, I guess, my first crime novel or my first thriller, You Were Never Really Here. So I guess I've been doing it for a while now, though, you know, I don't necessarily think in terms, well, I guess I do think in terms of genre. I mean, I'm very specifically writing, like trying to write with these doll books. You know, private detective novels, but they're also to be just books and, you know, prose. But I think my main thing that I do aim for is like this sensation of turning the page, of wanting to turn the page for the reader.
And it was the case for both of the doll books so far. They were both not a single sitting, but close enough to a single sitting. That was enjoyable, propulsive prose that, you know, wasn't, you know, we'll say dragging or anything. But tell me where Happy Doll comes from. Because when we spoke then, you said you were working on a sequel to You Were Never Really Here. And I don't know if that evolved into Happy or if you're still also, you know, keeping Joe in the background with your work.
Yeah. Well, that sequel, I got maybe about 90 pages down and it kind of withered or something, or I lost my passion or momentum, partly because of the film. I don't know, something about watching the film a number of times. I don't know, maybe I didn't feel the need to continue the character. Also, the film, for its ending, if anyone saw it who might be listening, borrowed from the beginning of my sequel. And I always have a difficult time with the word sequel. I make it sound like cough medicine.
I was going to ask, because I would listen back to our original one and realize that was the case. On the other hand, you pronounced P.G. Wodehouse correctly, and I failed to do that, which has been an ongoing embarrassment of mine. But anyway, go on.
I'm sure Plum, as he was known, would have something funny to say about that, and certainly nothing to feel.
I did it with Robert McCrum, who wrote the big introduction to Wodehouse Collection, and I was so embarrassed. It was terrible. But anyway.
Did you say Wodehouse?
Yep.
Yeah. And he was like, no, that's the Patrick Swayze movie. And just a tangent, I mean, Patrick Swayze was such a cool movie star. I did this film noir presentation here in LA about a year ago where I got to pick some movies set in LA kind of noir, and it was at a theater, and we watched Point Break, and he's just fantastic in that movie. Well, anyway, all this to say, the sequel, not the coffee medicine, the sequel to You Were Never Really Here kind of withered. And then what prompted the Happy Doll series was actually a prompt from Lee Child. I got contacted through Akashic Books, and that Lee Child was putting together an anthology. Akashic does that, like Boston noir, Chicago noir, London noir, and they have different guest editors usually for, noirish short stories set in those various cities. And Lee Child was the editor of one of these anthologies, but instead of a city or place, he wanted as a central theme cigarettes and cigarette smoking. He happens to be a big smoker himself, really enjoys nicotine. And so the final book was called The Nicotine Chronicles. So anyway, and I was very flattered that, that he's, somehow requested me through Akashic, and I'm a fan of the Jack Reacher novels. And so I don't know, I just somehow started wanting to write about a private detective who's visited by an old friend who's a heavy smoker who's in danger of losing his kidney, which became the sort of premise for A Man Named Doll. So I started writing that, and I think, it was probably a certain page count limit because it was an anthology, or word count limit. And I realized, I have something here I think I want to keep going with. So I ended up writing a different short story for the book, The Nicotine Chronicles. And then I returned to, this, was the beginning of A Man Named Doll. And I think one thing that was freeing for me, as opposed to You Were Never Really Here, was writing it in the first person. And also a character maybe not as, well, he's pretty broken, but not as broken as the Joe character from You Were Never Really Here. Like he was,
maybe bleak is the better term. I mean, they're both broken, but yeah, maybe less bleak.
Yeah, and Joe was so bleak, like a knife, and so this gave me greater latitude to play this character, and literally I gave him this odd name, Happy Doll, and I think that stemmed from a long time ago, and it might have been in my graphic novel that I did with your good friend Dean Haspiel, which is how you and I met. That in that book, The Alcoholic, my fictional protagonist is like a pulp writer, and I think and we did a bunch of the fake books he may have written, like Dean drew fake covers. And I was always obsessed with this title, and it's kind of cheesy and over the top, like A Broken Doll Plays No More. And I think that didn't actually make it into the graphic novel. But I just, for a long time, had this notion of wanting to put like maybe just even a broken doll in a title. And so anyway, somehow this character emerged, this Happy Doll, who in the first book goes by Hank, because he's, somewhat embarrassed by the name that his parents saddled him with. But in the second book, he's just dropped the name Hank. I think he says in the book that it was like a bald man giving up his toupee.
What is I would ask I'll say transition for you, or the launch from the first book to the second, because the second, in addition to Happy being more liberated in his own name, the writing itself seems, I want to say lighter, or there's some sort of jump, it feels like, from book one to book two. Did you feel anything in that process? Any sort of, okay, I worked out some of the kinks with A Man Called Doll, and now with the Wheel of Doll, it's rolling, as it were?
Yeah, well, I think like, you can't have the Wheel of Doll without a man named Doll. So, and so it was like I kind of learned the voice or learned what I could do a little bit. And then when readers did respond, I'm like, okay, this is working. So maybe that gave me some sail in my wind in my sail. And it's kind of like any endeavor, how in sports you keep evolving. And it was like the first book I was like learning to shoot free throws and layups. And then the second book, okay, I got those down. What else can this guy do or something, or this voice can do? And so I, in my own way, I guess in my mind, and I do enjoy writing these books, is that, in some ways they're a continual, just that they'll bleed one into the other. The Wheel of Doll follows a man named Doll, 6 months later. I've started the third Doll book, and it literally begins hours later after the second Doll book ends. It's just it's like an evolutionary process, like anything, you grow or change or evolve. I'm a big believer that, well, just a separate topic, but that human beings can change. So certainly a fictional character can change, and the voice can maybe, feel more mature or relaxed. I think I gained some confidence from the first book that like I could go places with this voice.
Yeah. Yeah, it really feels like that. It's not to slight the first book. The first book really feels like you're building the foundation well, and then we'll say, traumatic aspects of what takes place in the first one, really informs and opens up the voice in book two. And I'm really, looking forward to seeing where you go with this stuff. And of course, figure we'll have, 15 to 20 more Doll books as you and I keep getting together for podcasts every couple of years like this, and become a couple of doddering old men if we're not there already. But
I'm not going to speak for you. When I have memory lapses now, I call them junior, senior moments. But if I could write 15 of these, that would be crazy. I don't know if I'll be alive that long. But I want to keep writing them. I have fun making up those sentences, and I think more and more I can, through this lens of this character, observe the world, and all with the hope of giving the reader some entertainment, some pleasure. But when you said 15 or 18 or whatever,
I was just throwing it out.
No, but it made me think of Ross MacDonald, who
That's exactly what I was thinking.
Who wrote, I think, 18 Lou Archer novels, all of which I read over the course of the COVID years, which we're still living in. And I really admire Ross MacDonald. And of course, I'm sure we talked about it last time, Richard Stark wrote 24 Parker novels. But I've started these Doll books a little bit late in life, but I can write them in about, I have to do other things to bring in income, but I can write them, I think, in about 6 months. And then with the process of working with an editor and a copy editor and all that, you add another 4 months or so, or, maybe a year from start to finish. So anyway, but, I don't know if, like, at a certain point already in the third book, oh gosh, I don't want to jump the shark, that overused phrase, but I hope I could have the longevity of a Lou Archer.
Is there a degree of, I'll say, research going into this? In addition to the writing itself, how much sort of background do you really need to work on for some of the, without giving away anything about the plots, some of what transpires in the books?
Yeah, I'm not a big researcher. I think it's a little bit of a flaw. I try to make sure, like, medical things are within the realm of possibility. Obviously, I use Google. Legal things, I might try to Google, but I actually I think I saw an interview with Donald Westlake, who, his pseudonym was Richard Stark. And I saw some interview where he said something like he didn't do much research. He just wanted to make everything up. And that's kind of what I do. I just try to make everything up. But, obviously I don't want to make egregious factual mistakes, and I'll look at maps to make sure I'm getting roads correct, things like that. I mean, also, I've never been, part of the novel is set in Olympia, Washington, and I've never actually been there, but I looked at photographs of it, and I studied the city a little bit. So, for example, there's a location under a bridge in Olympia that does exist, and so so there's a minimal amount of research. I also like to fudge with the world. For example, there's a road in the novel that doesn't exist here in LA. This is ultimately a fictional world, so I take some liberties that way.
And setting things in LA and the West Coast versus New York and the area which you did for You Were Never Really Here?
What? I'm sorry, Gil. What's the question?
I was just leaving it as an open-ended thing. But the decision to base everything in L.A. or to keep the story primarily West Coast?
Yeah, well, I live in Los Angeles now. I've been here 8 years. And, I don't know. I think it was some writer. I'm not sure which writer. It might have been Hemingway. So many things are attributed to him. But what you see out your window is kind of what you want to write about. I mean, not always, of course. People create fake realms, or, they live one place but forever are writing about New York or Paris or the Midwest.
Well, you know me, I'm in Ringwood, so it's just deer and squirrel who go walking by my window. But
but beautiful trees, and you're in a beautiful spot up there. I always loved it. Anyone who might be listening, I grew up at the base of that mountain, about a mile or two away, in the town of Oakland, New Jersey. And, and then also, of course, I'm, a huge Raymond Chandler fan. And actually the neighborhood I live in here in LA is very much Chandler country. It's kind of old Hollywood. He wrote a lot about Franklin Boulevard, a lot of the apartment buildings and hotels that he writes about in the novels and in the early short stories are all set where I live. In fact, there's a short story of his called Try the Girl, which is one of the, I'm sure you're aware, and listeners might be aware, that Raymond Chandler, for most of his novels, or perhaps all of them, except maybe the final one, which I think is called Playback, he took his old short stories that he'd written and sort of Frankenstein them to sort of create his novels, and did a lot of rewriting. I mean, it's kind of brilliant what he did. But this one short story called Try the Girl, which is one of the ingredients ultimately for his novel Farewell, My Lovely, there's a description of a house that is just a half a mile up the road from me, which I often drive past. And it's a very vivid description of one of these houses that is sort of on the side of a hill and tucked down. And the Moose Malloy character in that story, who has a different name than that's his name in Farewell, My Lovely, I can't bring up the name, describes how he climbed up this balcony. And I drive past and I look at this balcony. So for me, it's really fun. I'm like, oh man, Chandler was driving around here, visiting people, going to parties or just whatever. And here's so for me, who loves Chandler the way some people probably study the Bible, it's like I'm really in Chandler country. So it's fun to have my private detective, which is, be in Los Angeles. I was thinking, I'm so out of touch with New York now. I don't know the city anymore.
I was going to ask, because as you mentioned that, it strikes me that L.A., Los Angeles, probably has more historical consistency. I get when you mention houses like that still being around, you can't come up with an awful lot of that for New York. You mentioned places from the 1940s or so, and it's long gone. That's been torn down, rebuilt, etc. But
yeah, I mean, there's some parts of the West Village which
sure,
Dawn Powell wrote about, or there's some, but I don't. But a lot of the bars or the speakeasies or speakeasies that were turned into bars, I don't know how many of those still are in operation, but some of those streets have maintained some of their original character. But LA, LA is so different from New York. I mean, it's mostly these what feels like suburban neighborhoods, and then these odd main streets, the main street here being over here, Hollywood Boulevard, or, Sunset Boulevard in terms of Hollywood itself. But then these neighborhoods, not really intact from the 40s, because my neighborhood was the original Hollywoodland neighborhood. And you see pictures from the 20s and 30s, and it was basically their version, very beautiful, of the McMansion, which were all these kind of beautiful Spanish houses. And they were built about maybe 60 to 100 yards from each other. You could see the original layout. And now you can still walk around. And for example, that Chandler house I mentioned was part of that original development. But now in that 100 yards, there will be 20 houses that were built over the last, 90 years, each from different decades, all shoving in on top of each other. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, as you know, my LA experiences are pretty scant. It's usually come in for a day and a half, record as many podcasts as I can, and then go to San Diego for a biotech conference. One of actually from my very first trip there, the musician, songwriter, etc., David Bayerwald, said that only the bus drivers know the city because they're the only ones who are going to neighborhood after neighborhood and not just whatever their local influence is.
Yeah, I mean, I've not ventured very far in my 8 years. I once felt like, Manhattan, you can really get to know. It's such a grid, and I was in Brooklyn and New York for decades, and I got to know certain neighborhoods of Brooklyn, but not how vast the borough is. Manhattan, I probably at a certain point knew better because of just the grid and being able to walk everywhere. And in some ways, it's not that large. I mean, when you go really far north, into the 180s, and if you start in the West Village, then it does get pretty big.
Yeah. I got an address for someone recently in the city, and the street numbers don't go that high, and just had to look on the Google map to see, 238th, that's still going.
Yeah,
so,
I know. I used to love, I used to take the bus in from New Jersey to the bus station, which was, I think, in the 180s. And I always loved being up in that neighborhood and, walking down. I would sometimes walk all the way from up there down Broadway to Columbia. And
it's where the bridge drops. Like 178th Street is where the George Washington crosses into Manhattan. Yeah. So that makes sense. But we were talking earlier about crime fiction influences, and you mentioned Stark and Stark/Westlake. Do you do contemporary crime fiction much? Do you keep up on, we'll now say your peers, because you're firmly a crime fiction writer?
I've never been good at being too on top of contemporary fiction. There's something about the moment, like I'm living in the present enough, so I like to read about, be in the past. But sure. I have been reading more contemporary crime writers or page-turner writers. I mean, often in the moment, blank on names, right in the moment.
Good. I'm glad to put you on the spot like that. Good.
Oh, no. It's but I mean, Richard Lang is someone I've read recently. A wonderful writer. She actually, totally blanking. I recently read a book by Ivy Pacoda that was really great. Megan Abbott, she's wonderful. Who are some of the other contemporary crime? I don't know. Adam Sternberg wrote a really. I'm thinking more of these like page turner books. I don't know the crime writers necessarily per se, but there's so many out there and so many people doing like amazing work. And I've read some of it, but not a lot of it. I tend to just stay in the past and weirdly reread people over and over again.
You mentioned you were compulsively reading the Stark novels back when we talked.
Yeah, I used to do that. I haven't now for a while, but I guess it's, I've never been so oriented towards music, but I feel like with people who love music, they'll listen to the same albums over and over for years. And I guess I'm like that with books. So there's 24 Parker crime novels, and then there were 4 about this under the name Stark, and then there were 4 about this other character named Grofield, and I didn't like those books as much, but I read the 24 Parker books since I started them maybe a dozen years or so ago. I've probably read them, all of them, maybe 4 or 5 times in a dozen years. And then right now I'm rereading Chandler yet again. But but if I go a few years, the stuff can be fresh. And I think it's really in a way, actually, I do think that there's a musical element. I like being in these sentences. So it's not so much about the stories, because I remember what's going to happen, but it's like, getting to revisit the prose.
Do you have, it'll sound like a weird influence question. Do you have to purge some of that in the process of your own writing for fear of getting subsumed by a Parker novel or a Parker sentence? Do you have to fight to sort of keep your own voice?
No, because I'm distilling their voices in my head and distorting them. They're my influences. And so I think that's why I reread them a lot, because it's like, I want to write sentences like them or create the effects that they create. Mostly that often, at least in the case of Stark, that page turning effect that, where you literally create some kind of chemical reaction in the reader where they just have to keep going or, stop and then keep going the next night or in the morning or whatever. And same thing, I glanced over my shelf. Lee Child really mastered that. But I listen in a sense to those writers, not audiobooks, but read them. And then they help me want to make those sentences on a kind of unconscious level, or it's like I'm studying. Now, I always struggle with my grammar. I struggle with feeling awkward, and I don't know how these writers do it, but they do it. But I just I'm just always wanting to learn. So that's why I keep rereading them. And I used to tell my writing students that it was okay to be deeply influenced like this. I often have talked about this, but I was struck years and years ago when I was watching that Ken Burns documentary on jazz, and almost every great jazz musician would talk about, maybe Miles Davis would say, I heard Charlie Parker and I wanted to make a sound like that. And then I would tell my students that, so through your soul or spirit, even if you're trying to make a sound like your favorite writer, it's going to come out differently. And I literally would say the embouchure of your person, and the embouchure, being how someone's mouth is shaped, because I knew that word from when I had to study French horn in the 6th grade, and my sister.
Glad I didn't mispronounce that one.
And my sister played the trumpet, and a lot of what your sound with these instruments had to do with the shape of your mouth. So even if two great trumpeter, if like one trumpeter wanted to mimic another one, he might not exactly get it because his mouth is different. Same thing with singers. And so it's the same thing with prose writing. Like I absorb these people, I admire them so much, and then through my embouchure, I create my sentences. It makes me think of like some kind of juicer, where you put something in, the carrot comes out shredded. So I put in these writers I like, and then out come my shortured sentences.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to, again, we'll say crime novels just because it's it's a genre. The idea of genre constraints or I'd say the parameters in which you're writing, do you find having a relative set of rules in place, somewhat liberating in those terms when it comes to this sort of writing?
I think so, because it reminds me, okay, especially just with this general notion of the page turner, like, all right, you can go on a tangent, but not for too long, because part of what you're doing here is wanting to keep the reader reading and not bore them. And I might need an action thing, or creating, like, usually these things work best if, it's a tight time frame of a week or 2 weeks to keep an urgency. So these constraints, which are mostly, my own sense of what makes these books fun, I do find helpful, because it kind of gives you a frame to put your picture in. I was thinking about this, like I was speaking to a friend of mine, a wonderful prose writer, and Susan Minot, and she, is not writing genre fiction the way I am. And every time she writes a novel or short story, it's kind of reinventing the wheel in a sense. Of course, there's always the goal to, certain structures with anything, especially if you're not going to be completely experimental. But I realized in talking to her that every novel is just such a reinvention of how to tell a story, which could be very fun. But that could be a struggle, because it's like, is this shape working? Is this the right shape? Now, of course, certain novelists used very similar shapes, or always write in the third person, or they mixed it up and they would have, rotating points of view or something. So anyway, I realized that part of what makes me writing in the genre and writing a series is that I don't have to reinvent the wheel every time.
I do seem to recall her having a story about a writer who can't write, trying to explain why she's not able to, which we've all gone through. And, using that as the propulsive mechanism for a story is one of those, what if I actually turn this inability to write into writing?
Well, I think her most recent book, actually I'm looking at it on the shelf, is Why I Don't Write. Which is kind of funny, because you're holding this book that she's written. And it's a wonderful collection of short stories. She's a really fine writer.
Yeah, I'll have to connect with her, because the first person I recorded with in person after the pandemic began is a friend of hers. And at the time I was like, oh yeah, we need to follow up, and you got to connect me with Susan. And I never did. So, I'll beat you over the head for a connection at some point. Yeah. This is how I get to another 500 episodes, okay? This, it's a slow process, but I get there eventually.
What is this, 503 or 4?
Yeah, you'll be 503.
503, that's a cool number.
Because I had Jerome Charon last week also talking about Hollywood and L.A. in this Orson Welles and Rita Hayworth novel, which your discussion of Chandler sort of put me in mind of. But, well, let me ask, the sort of interesting question about the Wheel of Dahl is the character's exploration of Buddhism and your comment earlier about whether people, whether fictional or real, can change. So, well, first, mention a little about the character's dive into Buddhism, and from there we'll go into human nature, if you're okay with discussing that.
I'm okay. I'm obviously, I don't know if I'm qualified to discuss human nature, but we're two people on a podcast having a conversation. Also, I wanted to say earlier, when you said my trips to LA are about doing as many podcasts as possible and then going to a biotech conference in San Diego. I thought, I don't know if any human being has ever said that before. You know, there's not too many things that have never been said, but someone saying, yeah, I come to LA, try to do as many podcasts as possible, and then go to San Diego for a biotech conference. I mean, has another human being ever said that they come to LA and do as many podcasts? You know, I'm repeating myself. So I thought that was interesting.
My fear is that one of you guys will end up using me as a character at some point in future, and it will be so obvious that it's me based on, picking up lines like that. Mm-hmm. Well, and again, feel free. But
why do you fear that?
Just because you guys might see some aspect of me that I don't see and just lay me bare in front of either the world or myself. Not my parents, because they're not going to read it, but, Yeah.
No, I get it.
It was bad enough when Ruth Skur, when I recorded with her recently, the woman who wrote the John Aubrey biography. Mm-hmm. She also did one on Napoleon recently. She, being a biographer, looked me up before we started, mm-hmm. and she just noticed one or two things that I had written over time that I put up publicly, but assume no one's ever going to read or put two and two together on, and she did. So now I'm living in dread of writers actually, hey, who is Gil anyway? So yeah. Anyway, I asked you something before we got to this point.
Who is Gil Roth? That sounds like a Christopher Guest movie. Who is Gil Roth?
I've been improving it for 51 years. So, yes, it's about Buddhism and whether people can change. Yeah. That's where we were.
Yeah. Anyway, one other thing, and then I'll answer that question.
Oh, sure.
I am noticing, we're recording this a lot of times lately, and I don't do a lot of podcasts. You sort of see the person you're talking to. In this case, I don't see you, Gil, but I have headphones on, which I never wear. But so your voice is right in my ears, and you have obviously you do podcasts, but you have a very melodious voice, which in another era would have been very much a radio voice.
Thanks. I did the high school radio show when I was 17 years old at Lakeland High School, which used to take on your high school. I had the voice even back then. I guess post-puberty, it immediately went into FM radio mode. But the nice thing,
95.5 WPLJ.
Yep. The nice thing with the guests like you who I've recorded with before, I don't mind the remote sessions as much because at least we have seen each other. Mm-hmm. But when it's a brand new guest and it's remote, it's mentally so much more challenging for me not knowing what their faces do, mm-hmm. which I know sounds weird, but I was, before the pandemic, so used to just looking at another person for an hour and seeing them. And it's a lot different this way.
Yeah, well, it's a big part of communication, obviously, these visible cues. I mean, in psychoanalysis, one doesn't look at the analyst. I mean, not always, but I mean, some analysts might do it differently, but, for the most part, traditionally, one doesn't look at the analyst so that you're not having to maybe adjust to facial cues. You're just opening up this stream of consciousness to this listener. Anyway, I don't know. Do you want to? I feel like I should get to your question. But,
can a man change, and can Dahl change?
Yeah. Well, the book is called The Wheel of Dahl, which is like a kind of Buddhist reference, because I've been doing a lot of reading of Buddhist texts the last 7 years, and have gotten so much out of it. And I'm no expert by any means. I'm like basically probably in terms of Buddhism. I don't know, maybe I would be a toddler, or not even a toddler. I might be a newborn. Like, I barely have an understanding, but what I do understand, I find it to be a very beautiful philosophy. And so one of the things I kept reading about, and I liked the language of it, was that it was this sort of thing talking about that the Buddha turned the Dharma wheel as he communicated his insights to the people around him. It was sort of called the turning of the Dharma wheel. And I'm not sure how many times he turned it. I could get it wrong, but I think it's something like 12 times or 4 times for the 4 noble truths of Buddhism. And because the Four Noble Truths kind of lay out the path to enlightenment, or at least lessening your suffering. And so this is the wheel of Dal. Like, so you might have like, you know, it might be called the Dharma wheel or the wheel of Buddha. And so this is Dal's wheel, in which he kind of messes things up. Like, you know, the Buddha lays out a beautiful path, but Dal kind of really messes things up, and he's just begun studying Buddhism himself. So the Wheel of Dal kind of refers to that. It also, you know, there is the term the Wheel of Justice, or, you know, the wheels of justice. So again, this is about him perhaps seeking justice, and just the notion of the wheel. And yeah, in terms of change, I do think human beings are capable of change. I've tried very hard to change. You know, we're all such works in progress. I mean, I saw something, I read someone, you know, saying, sort of quoting the Buddha, maybe it was in a Thich Nhat Hanh book. He said that the Buddha said, you know, whether or not he said this exactly, but this is a distillation of his teachings. The Buddha said, "I teach only suffering and the transformation of suffering." So it's about trying to transform our struggles, our confusion, and Buddhism says you can change if you work at it. And I believe in that, you know, that human beings can change. I mean, certainly we grow older, our bodies change, and so hopefully our minds change, and we can change our behaviors. If we have destructive behaviors, we can reverse them, you know, and all with the goal of trying to lessen our suffering and lessen the suffering of others, not hurt others. You know, and we all hurt people, unfortunately. But the thing is to try to learn from that and not cause further suffering.
Within the book, or within both books, you've got a character who sort of becomes an accidental killing machine, mm-hmm. and nonetheless is trying to fix things to the point at which, you know, by the end he's no longer accidental. He's really deliberate and focused on something that he knows, you know, isn't the path, but nonetheless human nature, or his nature, seems to take over. It's not a question at all. It's just, you know, it's such a fascinating book in such concise terms, the way you put it all, over the course of about 200 pages in The Wheel of Dal, seeing him try to improve and try to change and try to make amends for who he was, and find himself even deeper in the hole karmically, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's why it's the Wheel of Dal, because like the Buddha's turning of the Dharma wheel is to lessen suffering, is to lessen negative karma. But the way Dal turns the wheel, because he's still very much a work in progress. It's increasing suffering. It's increasing his negative karma, and he has profound regrets and confusion, and so, but he's gotten caught up in this. And you know, a big Buddhist concept, and again, anyone listening who knows anything about Buddhism, I'm sorry if I mangle things. This is just my take or my evolving take, but there's the concept of samsara, which is cyclical existence, and even pleasurable things can be samsaric. Like you finish an ice cream and you're like, oh, I want another one. So the idea that samsaric things always lead to dissatisfaction, but it's also a cycle of suffering, and so many human behaviors can, you know, fall under this, and that we all have these repetitions of things that we do that are very painful for ourselves and oftentimes for others. So a very samsaric behavior might be like, oh, I drank too much, I'm not going to drink again. Oh, 2 nights later, I drank too much, I'm not going to drink that much again. Or for years, you don't acknowledge that you're drinking too much, but you keep having all these problems because of drinking too much. And so that's really getting caught up in like very cyclical suffering. And so Dahl is trying to break out of his cyclical suffering, but now he's got really bad samsara because he keeps ending up in these violent situations, but he's responsible. That's a big thing with the Four Noble Truths. Again, I apologize, but one is acknowledge your suffering, the first noble truth, acknowledge that life is suffering, that we all suffer, that this is there's death and dying and confusion and other people and all sorts of issues. And then two, study your suffering, see what you do to make things worse, or the things you do over and over that just keep you in like a merry-go-round of pain, or a Ferris wheel of pain, and acknowledge those things. Do you get angry? Do you lash out? Do you eat too much? Do you do drugs? Do you gamble? Do you gossip? Do you constantly engage in negative thinking? All these things. And so you have to see your part in it and then try to stop these things. And if you stop these things, you begin to get a glimpse of peace, which is the third noble truth. And then the fourth noble truth is just keep working at it, using all the various Buddhist concepts to try to lead basically an ethical life. And anyway, I'm going on.
No, this is stuff I find fascinating because it gets us to this, the over question, beyond the Wheel of Dahl and the series is, whether people change over time or whether we're still carrying the seeds of who we were when we were children, I guess, when we got, the wound, whatever it was. Well, I say we, but really I just mean me. Can you help me, Jonathan? This is what I'm getting.
Well, I don't know. It's such a big, interesting question. I mean, obviously it seems like certain people don't change, or they get really stuck, or they're stuck forever. Or I think there's some funny Jerry Seinfeld line about, he's like, why get new friends? Because you're just going to get someone else that has the same problem that you listened to for 20 or 30 years. So we all have, and Freud called it repetition compulsion. But I do feel, look, we change regardless. Time is going to change us. Our body's going to disintegrate. We're going to get old and die, or, not get old. I mean, we change. Now, whether or not we can change our behaviors, I do think we're capable of it. We see that all the time in the world. Some people maybe aren't capable, or they can't get unstuck. And though I'm sure they would like to. But so, yeah, I do think we can take these seeds. That's all, that's again, that quote, I teach only suffering and the transformation of suffering. So if there is a childhood pain, it's to work with that, to try to increase your compassion for yourself and for others, and to also see, what does that pain make me do? Am I this thing that may have gotten, to use maybe a Freudian term or a psychoanalytic term, this thing that got interjected into me as a child, let's say negative thinking or self-hating thinking or overly critical thinking or perfectionism, at a certain point it becomes ours, and it's up to us whether or not we want to keep that going or try to work with it. We don't have, if we generate self-hating perfectionistic thinking, we can also ungenerate it. Our thinking is everything, and it is within our control, through various techniques. And the first being waking up to your own thinking.
Mm-hmm. When it came to studying Buddhism, have you been doing it solo, or did you get instruction of any kind?
It's really been solo. I'd like to, one of the things they talk about in the literature, is finding a teacher, finding a community. My teachers are the people I read, and I have a teacher, in a sense, for me, that's not necessarily, she's not a Buddhist, but she's very much a teacher, an elder and a wise person. So I feel I do have a teacher, though not necessarily a Buddhist teacher, but her philosophy would feel, I think, it feels very aligned with what I've been reading in the books. But yeah, it's just been my own solo study to try to deal with my pain. And in the last few weeks, I've been a little bit, I don't know, resistant, but for the most part, for the last few years, I really tried to develop a practice of reading some kind of philosophical text in the morning for 15 minutes and sitting quietly and thinking about it, trying to meditate a little, trying to quiet my mind. And so and that's how I've kind of, the Dalai Lama, with this wonderful writer, I think a woman named Thubten Chodron. Anyway, they have this long, very epic series. I think there's like 8 thick volumes on Buddhist philosophy, and I think I've gotten through the first, well, maybe I'm halfway through the second one, maybe 3/4, but I take months to read these things because I only read like 3 or 4 pages at a time. And then there was almost like a prequel. They were like, okay, before you actually read this huge explanation of Buddhism, you might want to read this one, which was like a general introduction. So then I went and read that one, and then I've read a lot of Thich Nhat Hanh, and then I actually picked up this other book. I don't know the author's name. It's about the 6 perfections that one should practice on the Buddhist path, which I think are like generosity, ethical conduct, patience, perseverance, concentration, and wisdom. I think, and to work on those things. And those align with, oh gosh, I'm really sounding like, and I'm so embarrassed if anyone actually understands Buddhism. They'll be like, oh my God, this guy should not be talking out loud. But there's something, the 4 Noble Truths are supported by the Eightfold Noble Path, which is all about trying to conduct oneself in a mindful, compassionate, and kind way. So like the Eightfold Noble Path might even be what they might call right work, like having a vocation that, well, I guess has meaning, but also doesn't cause suffering or contributes in some way, or, right thinking, which would be trying to deal with one's negative thinking or unkind thinking or looping thinking, right speech, being very careful with what you say so as not to hurt others, but only to maybe encourage. And probably I'm messing that up. And then there's something called, well, this isn't part of the Eightfold Noble thing, but anyway, I feel like I'm talking. Well, anyway, I enjoy talking about it, and I shouldn't apologize so much. And I gave the caveat that I'm still, like, I'm basically so at the very beginning. But if anyone hears this and has interest, I really encourage them to just go to your bookstore in the section of philosophy or spirituality, and there's also great Hindu texts and Taoism stuff. I find all of it very helpful.
What's interesting, though, it puts me in mind of, as Jews, what we do on Kol Nidre, the beginning of Yom Kippur, where we beat our breast and ask for forgiveness for like gossiping against one's neighbors, for this, for that, for the other, except we're doing it on an annual basis and it never seems to fix anything for some of us. But, we still ask to be carried over for another year of life. I just, it's an interesting crossover, interesting, these attempts at how we're supposed to either ask forgiveness or try to forgive ourselves, I suppose.
Well, both, but also, all the religions, and they've been around a long time. For the most, they're all saying the same thing: be a good person.
Golden rule seems to really, be that common denominator.
They all say the same thing, and they're all beautiful that way. I recently picked up some, my mom gave me some, I got to dive into them, books, that studied the Jewish religion and the Torah, and I was raised in the Jewish faith, and I'm still a Jewish person. I'm not a Buddhist. I don't necessarily have, if I was to have a label, the world would label me a Jew. But yeah, I mean, it's a simple thing to say, but they all really try to tell human beings the same thing. Be kind, and because you want to be kind to others. And then also, if you're kind, your life goes better. And so it's, anyway, that's the distillation of thousands of years of, but it's, and that's where, it can be, we all have faltered. We've all not been kind, or we've been confused or reckless or out of control, mindless, and we hurt ourselves and hurt others. But at a certain point, hopefully, maybe we begin to wake up, and we can align the way we conduct ourselves with, a higher standard.
And I'm interested in seeing how it plays out in Happy's life in subsequent books. But in fact, when I threw out the 15 to 20 more books, do you think more than one book ahead with this? Have you planned out ideas for where Happy goes, or is it really going to be within the context of each book, sort of launching the next one?
Yeah, well, like I said, I started the third one. The story I thought I was going to tell has kind of shifted, which is sort of fun. Yeah. A lot of times I kind of like to know where I'm getting to. I mean, like, you need this goal. You can't always have it when you begin. Sometimes you just need to begin, and then the goal emerges that kind of drives you forward to where you think this all needs to end. I once saw, there was this great book that I used when I was a teacher, and it was a compilation of almost aphoristic writing advice that was compiled by George Plimpton in the Paris Review from all the Paris author interviews.
Oh, yeah, I've got that. The writer's chapbook, I think.
Yeah. And so there would be these sections like beginnings, endings, characters, dialogue, revision, and they were so great. It would be like these snippets taken from these interviews over 50 years, like, from Joyce Carol Oates to Hemingway to Marquez. I mean, they got everybody. And so there was this great E.M. Foster quote that when he writes something, there's always this place he feels that he has to get to, maybe either physically or metaphorically. And so I remember that the quote was, with a passage to India, that book, he knew he had to get to these caves, that something happened in these caves. And so for the third book, I think I'm not quite sure. I think I know where I want Happy to get to, which is important because that pulls you through this story like a magnet. And then I did have thoughts like, okay, so then I want to be able to leave it where then it could continue, like a Lou Archer. So I don't think too far ahead. I've been playing with titles because I have this wish to maybe have the word doll in every title, which signals to the reader, okay, here's another doll book or something. And it's a little bit, there was John D. MacDonald, not Ross MacDonald, but I think every one of his books about his, recurring character, Travis McGee, had like a color in the title. Yeah,
that's exactly what I was thinking when you said you were going to try to get doll into every one. I was thinking of the Travis McGee books.
Yeah. So I've been jotting, because I had a title for this first one, but then because the story changed, like, oh, maybe that doesn't work now, but there could be another book where that title works. So yeah. I'm somewhat thinking ahead, and I want him to keep growing and evolving himself.
What's the pandemic been like for you?
Oh, good question. I mean, as a writer, somewhat isolated person anyway. And then as I've gotten older, my need for socializing or being out and about really lessened. Maybe I didn't get as much out of it or had done enough of it in my life, and maybe just sort of slowing down. But so in some ways, like, yeah, I just gotten quieter and quieter. And oh God, I don't, we've all been, it's also been this terrible nightmare. Like, I went to New York for the first time in 2.5 years. And
you didn't call? I'm just kidding. I'm doing the Jewish mother thing.
Yeah, no, I was there literally 48 hours for a work thing, and it was so brutally hot. But I did manage to see our mutual friend Dean. That was one of the few people I saw, and I saw one other friend in my 48 hours. But the taxi driver who took me from the airport, we started chatting, and maybe I said I hadn't been back to New York in 2.5 years. And right away he started, talking about COVID. And he said he had 11 friends and family members die in the last 2.5 years. And I mean, this is just enormous what's happened. It's like in Star Wars when Alec Guinness is in the Millennium Falcon. I'm sounding like a real fanboy here. I don't know. I'm pulling these things out. And I forget the name of the planet. I want to say Algernon, but that's flowers for Algernon.
Alderaan.
Alderaan. But maybe that was Luke's, but maybe that's not the planet. But some planet had...
Tatooine was Luke's planet. Alderaan was where Leah's people were, and that's what got blown up.
Oh, God. And I still feel sad about that, because Alec Guinness was so beautiful in that moment where suddenly he sort of loses his balance, and this incredible grief comes over his face. And then they're like, what's the matter? And he knows that he needs to be careful what he says to these young people around him. And he says, there's been a disturbance in the force. And I think maybe he needs to go be alone in that moment. So anyway, it's just this incredible worldwide tragedy of so much death. And we've, been numb to it, and people are trying to live with it, but still lots of people are dying. And this particular man lost like 11 people. And then there's a friend of mine who wrote me an email, and I owe him an email. I don't know if he listens to your podcast, but a fascinating guy that maybe you should have on, named Glenn Shepard. He's like an ethnobotanist who, is an expert on the indigenous peoples of Brazil and the Amazon, and speaks all these languages, and also knows, so much about the plants and the medicines there, and the lost wisdom. But anyway, he wrote me an email, and I think partly I haven't been able to write back if he should hear this, but maybe I'll write it today. I think he said some staggering number of people that he had lost to COVID, and it somehow stopped me. I need to write him back, but I just, so we've all, I had someone very dear to me in New Jersey die from COVID. I've been very concerned about trying to keep my elderly parents safe. It's been, I'm not saying anything unique here. We've all been just dealing with this, and I'm giving a reading Tuesday night. It's going to be indoors at a bookstore. The numbers are down. People are going about their lives, but there's a good chance that, percentage-wise, if 30 people come to the reading, one of those people might have COVID. And so I'm also even wondering, ethically, should I be giving a reading still in this, time? And, and then also when you meet with people, like I do try to keep a little bit distance anyway, because the main way to get it is if you're talking for an extended period and you're absorbing these particles. And, I just keep hearing anecdotally of people getting sick. And sometimes, especially this summer, it seems like people have really gotten knocked for a loop, out of it for 10 days or lingering stuff. I don't know. It's just been a worldwide tragedy. And, but part of the ongoing, imbalance that we've created with the planet. I mean, everything, whatever, the environment, we're really struggling.
I was glad Happy didn't get infected, even though he has an opportunity to at one point in the book.
Yeah, well, this book takes place right as, like, this book takes place January of 2020. And there are two people he encounters who are sick, and maybe they might have COVID, because I think a lot of people were getting sick in January 2020, and we weren't calling it COVID yet. And I know a friend of my parents, who, before it was officially declared a major emergency, a sweet older man, maybe in his early 80s, like March 1st, moved into an assisted living, and, I think a week later had passed away. And he, suddenly he had massive heart failure. But we now know, of course, that a lot of, the COVID, I think, especially with the older people, got into the hearts and did all sorts of things. And he was never listed as a COVID fatality. But, so anyway, the book takes place right before COVID. And so.
Yeah. Well, we'll, again, see how it extends fictionally, much less, how we're dealing with it on a day-to-day basis in real life. But one of the things I noticed when I was going back and checking out our first conversation, in the webpage for the episode, I linked your name to a Twitter account that no longer exists. Did you escape social media pretty well?
Yeah, I decided to. I think I joined Instagram 18 months or so ago for a man named Dahl. And then I had been on Twitter. I had once had an account, like when I had my TV show Bored to Death, but then I deleted that account. And years ago, I deleted Facebook. But then I started up a Twitter account maybe 10 years ago or so, or 9 years ago, when I first published an ebook version of You Were Never Really Here. And I was like, oh, I have no way to get a word out. I used to have an email list, but I'm not very technological, and I had all these AOL addresses, and it was all a mess. So I had no way to let anybody know anything, which is fine. But anyway, in the last year, I decided to just get off of all social media. I know some people can do great things with it, or maybe create change, but it was. I just feel there's so much that's wrong with the whole experience and its impact on our culture, and I just didn't want to be a part of it anymore. The constant need to the self-promotion. I wanted to just drop out of it all, and also, unless you're really amazing at such things, I don't think it. Maybe I'm just happy for the books to be out there, and I hope. If people find them and get some pleasure, that's great. I just wanted to get out of the thing of
the karmic wheel.
That
off the social media wheel.
Also, the world of social media feels scary to me. There's so much anonymity and unkindness and strangeness, and so I just dropped out of the whole thing. And but I still. And actually, Twitter doesn't let me look very much, but I still like to sometimes, well, I shouldn't say like, it's pretty destructive, all these political pundits, I follow some of this stuff, but Twitter only let me look at a few tweets, and then it's like,
you need to sign in.
And then I'm like, I got to get my fix of Sarah Kendzior, but I only get 2 or 3 tweets, or, or Kyle Griffin, who gives all these headlines, all the time. And, but so I still look at Twitter. It still, I say it still impacts me negatively, because
that's what I wondered, if you were able to escape, what that does to you, or if it's still a compulsion that's there.
There's still a compulsion, at least with the political stuff, to continually inject poison into my mind. I mean, I'm going to get this news anyway, but we're all caught up in this huge drama of, the American experience. And you asked COVID. One thing that happened in COVID, I really became someone who watched a lot of TV. And so you know,
Those first few months, everybody I talked to was on Tiger King. They were all like back in 2020. That was the thing that everybody was immersed in, I guess.
I miss that. I like escapist fare, and you know, I just want to escape from the world. So I recently went berserk and over 2 months watched all 89 episodes of the show Vikings, and which I really did enjoy, and I thought it was I couldn't believe the epic magnitude of this series, and just knowing a little bit about television production, just so many extras and shooting on water and battle scenes, and it was really amazing. And then there was this one moment, maybe I was, because of being insane and binging this TV late at night, kind of like the page turning experience, I like really cried at this one very tender moment. But this was, you know, after almost 60 episodes of being with these characters, and I was very connected to them, and they've sort of become my friends in the same way that some of these Twitter personalities are almost like friends, and which is not correct, and not, you know, not saying normal or whatever, but
but it's like that. You know, there's that with the virtual, especially, that friendly versus friends thing, and people constantly crossing that border thinking, oh yeah, I really know this person. Like, no, you know their internet face, which is different than the emotional connection you build towards a character who's, you know, again, well constructed, and you're following a storyline as far as you are.
Yeah, but that's like, we're having this huge ongoing epic series called American Politics that it's like, I just want it to be over, like Game of Thrones. Like, okay, we need to end. Can we just somehow? But we're never going to. I don't know.
Trust me, I'm involved.
Are just so confused.
Yeah. No, I was gonna say I'm involved in a crazy little subplot of that American politics drama right now, and it's just this FDA funding thing, and it's still tied to deep-rooted animosities that people have towards each other, and philosophies of things. And I'm just like, I just want to get this goddamn bill passed, and I can still, you know, see all the forces that are blocking it. Yeah. So, you know, there is a certain, I'd say Robert Caro-esque angle where you could, you know, go into what all that does as far as narrative and story goes, but it also just drives us into the ground, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, everything is choice, right? So we can choose how much we absorb, but it's really devious. Like, I'm obviously still on AOL, so I open my AOL, and there's always like this front page that has headlines and pictures of the politicians, and you know, and so you see it, and it's like being in a supermarket with, you know, they used to play Muzak or something. It's like there's this very negative Muzak playing all the time. And it becomes one more way to try to discipline oneself. What one puts in one's eyes, in our mind. You know, a lot of people try to eat carefully. We also need to be careful about what we put in our eyes and our minds. That's one of the things with writing crime fiction. I need to read this essay. Don Winslow wrote an essay about writing about violent things. And I want to be careful. And, you know, I was so enamored of this genre, but it is a violent genre. And what, am I contributing something bad to the world, or am I, by showing happy in conflict, is that a good thing? You know, can he evolve past this violence? Can I still tell a gripping story? You know, so these are interesting questions, but yeah, it's such a, you know, it's one of our modern dilemmas. Just, you brought up the thing of social media. You know, when you and I were a kid, and I'm just repeating what everyone says all the time, you know, there were like 5 TV stations, or, you know, there was like the 3 networks and maybe 2 local ones and PBS. So maybe there were 6 stations or something, 6 or 7. And there was 3 news shows on at night, and you had your newspapers, and this was, you know, this is what maybe you could manage your intake a little bit more. But then things began shifting 20, 30 years ago when, CNN and news around the clock and making it entertainment. And then the internet was like even a further explosion of this. Anyway, I'm just saying things that everyone has said a million times over and over.
No, but it's all part of the, we need to be entertained constantly. We need to be stimulated constantly.
Distracted and frightened. Yeah. And, all these, I don't study it much, but, I think, wasn't it revealed, that Facebook knows that if someone's upset, this is good. They're going to stay on the site more and click more. So it's like,
I'll tell you,
let's upset them,
There's a cycle of something that I'm going to write, or that I'm supposed to write, that I'll never get around to because of an abject failure as a writer. But the idea was, I know, I kid. I actually said it 5 years ago, or 4.5 years ago when we talked, but you corrected me then too.
I know, but the thing is, when we repeat these things, and we all do, it's like we're kind of,
reifying
I know you're doing
you're right.
it jokingly, but maybe in a way you're being unkind to yourself every time you say that. And
That's true.
And then you're locking yourself in this box. But I just hearing you say it out loud, because we all have these thoughts. You just happen to say it out loud. So.
Yeah, but it's shtick for me. But it comes from the wound. So, it was this idea centered around a couple of words that have been stolen or hijacked by tech and our culture today. And I had two of the words for the longest time. And I wrote about this in my weekly email last week without saying what the words were. Yeah, well, the third word that came to me was engagement. And how it meant something different once upon a time. And now all it means is, how outraged can we keep you that you're going to be doom scrolling again and again? How much engagement can we get out of you? The other two words are moderation and fulfillment, which meant something different before all this. And now, now means something really, really dehumanized, I guess.
It's interesting you mentioned that word engagement. I have this fun friend. He's kind of a philosopher, a rogue philosopher, interesting fellow, happens to be a carpenter, like Jesus. But anyway, he's like, his philosophy is the philosophy, and I don't think this is a word of like, and I don't know if he uses this word exactly, of engagementism, and he's an engagementist, but in a very positive way, which is kind of like, the word mindful or mindfulness has maybe gotten overused, but it's like, be engaged, be in the moment, appreciate beauty. So in his case, the word engagement has to do with,
it's a positive,
of being in the now and seeing that which is beautiful and positive.
I have to say, when the last things you said to me back in 2018, I wrote it down here. Making art is a good way to spend time on the planet. And all things considered, that act of looking, that act of diving into the world, whether it's to make an actual piece of art or not, that's almost secondary at this point. That turned out to be a lot of wisdom there, Ames.
I thank you, but I mean, and I don't remember saying that, but if one has the favorable circumstances where you're not struggling all day long just to make money or, feed yourself or your family, and you can have a little bit of freedom to make art, that is a beautiful thing, because it's, we're surrounded by beauty, and so it's like, let's try to add to it. And again, maybe to share it with others, and also, and I think it gives the maker a good feeling, that they've made something, and we're such complex creatures. There's like, I know you draw a lot, and I don't know, we just have this need or wish to express. And
okay, so maybe I'll get to writing. I won't call myself an abject failure going forward. That's
but you said that so strong.
Fine.
You'd been wrapped on this. You're like, I didn't mean to wrap you on the knuckles. I won't call myself a failure, but I'm a failure for having said it. No, it's like, oh my God, it's like you're in a maze of failure. We all are, because we're all so hard on ourselves. But I know this is like, look, you speak to writers, you are a writer, you create all the time, your podcasts are a form of writing because of your questions, your thinking, you know, and I know you write essays, I haven't read your fiction, your newsletter is always like, you know, I don't read every one, but it's just so charming in your voice. But, you know, if you are struggling to write, and I'm sure you know this, but like the most basic advice, and I give this to myself and to anyone out there who might hear this, and you know, it's like, set a reasonable goal. Just sit for an hour, or like for me to get these doll novels done, it's like just trying to get 1 page a day done. You know, like don't feel like I sit down, I've got to create War and Peace. It's like such a slow process. So if you could just set reasonable goals for yourself. This was something I was struggling to write my first novel, and this graduate student at Princeton said to me, just sit for an hour and just have a pad. And if you need to, just doodle. That's why I always like to have a pad next to the computer, because I think we were originally trained to make art and write, and, you know, through holding a pencil or a crayon. And there's a big connection between the brain and the hand. And I think of that Michelangelo painting. I think it's Michelangelo, like the hand of God reaching to David. So like you can just jot things down so it doesn't have to feel so weighty, you know, but just either sit for an hour or have a goal. You know, I'm just going to write a page a day, or I'm just going to sit an hour a day, or I'm going to write half a page. I mean, I think Graham Greene, you know, is such, you know,
it was 500 words.
Yeah, it was like the 500.
I was just reading someone about him this week.
Yeah, I think Hemingway was the 500 words. And, you know, so anyway, I'm sure you know all this, but if you are struggling, I think the way is to set reasonable goals for yourself, and don't feel like you've somehow got to have it all figured out, like writing down that first word.
Yeah, and that's always been my hang up. Why am I not the combination of Thomas Pynchon and Philip Roth on the first draft out of the blue? So, yeah, I'm with you. But what I like is we've managed...
Philip Roth or Thomas Pynchon out of the gate.
Yeah, I know.
You know?
And it's one of those things where I never am able to internalize the idea that these things were edited. They took time. They weren't perfect. They weren't in this form. But yeah, that's but the thing I was going to say, though, I like the fact that we managed to call back to the Paris Review Writers at Work thing to get your writing practice down. Is there any... if you were being interviewed by the Paris Review in terms of the, you know, so tell us about your writing process. Anything you have beyond the spend at least an hour and have a pad nearby?
Let's see, the reasonable goal, the reasonable word count thing. I mean, one thing you know, again, these are all very practical things and have been said many times, but one thing I noticed as I'm trying to write this third doll book is, you know, I go back about 10 or 15 pages and kind of revise those or rewrite those, and it kind of gets me back into the flow. And then I try to push forward another page. So sometimes you don't get to that other page, or you cut something, or maybe you write that page within those 10 pages you're revising. One thing I have to be careful about is sometimes wanting to go back to the beginning and exhausting myself because I'm rewriting too much, you know, and so I need to start maybe 10 pages back, polish those, move forward. Then, you know, the next time, start again at that point. But so it's, I think I'm making myself clear, but sometimes I go back to the beginning. Like right now, I'm not going to be able to work on the novel for a week or more. So when I come back to it, I'll probably start at the beginning again and making sure I feel okay with it. And then, you know, eventually trying to move forward. I think the other thing I try to keep in mind for me is pace. I picked up a thing from the writer Jean Rice years ago. Rhys. I don't know if I'm pronouncing her name correctly.
You may as well, because I was going to go with Jean Rhys. So, I have no idea.
Well, anyway, I don't know how to...
Thanks for taking the plunge. Yeah.
I remember reading one or two of her books, and I thought, and they were wonderful novels, and I thought, why do I read her so quickly? And I realized she had very short paragraphs. So I'm like, okay, the short paragraph, because a lot about it is if you want to, some writers are wonderful with their long paragraphs and they hold people. I get very worried about wanting to entertain the reader, so I try to have short paragraphs. I try to do the numeric thing where you have lots of chapters so that the reader can have a sense of moving forward. And I have to remember this thing. There was a great P.G. Wodehouse quote somewhere. I don't know if it was in the Paris Review, but I've read it somewhere, or at least I imagine I have. And he said, try to give pleasure with every sentence, which, sounds like, could be upsetting to you because you're like, I want to be Thomas Pynchon immediately. Yeah. But the thing of that each sentence is, could be a beautiful thing. And to try to give pleasure. And to really have a set, as much as possible. People have busy lives or have to do things to make a living, might not always be able to write, but if you can get into some kind of schedule, even if it's like 2 days a week, that on Monday and Wednesday mornings you're going to work from 8 to 10. And luckily my life is arranged where basically my afternoons are for writing every day, and I know that I'll have that time, and I also don't do things like, well, not especially in COVID, but I never was big on meeting people for lunch, because then it's like, oh, I'm just exhausted for the rest of the day, just from conversation, and I'm not going to be able to write, so I sort of need to stay quiet in the morning, and then have the afternoons for writing.
I will let you get back to it. Jonathan, thanks so much for coming on the show. I love The Wheel of Dahl. Can't wait for the third one. Maybe we'll get to do this in person during one of my quick trips to LA to record as many podcasts as I can before going to a biotech conference in San Diego.
I've never heard anyone say that before.
It's funny. I hear that all the time for some reason.
But also maybe, I don't know when I'll be back on the East Coast or make it back to my hometown, but I'd like to see maybe my old stomping grounds again, and you're right in my old stomping grounds. You're right by the woods where I often went hiking and all that. And I think we must have talked about it last time, that it was so strange when they found a location for You Were Never Really Here, and it was, right on that hill where you live.
The Ramapo Lake,
And it was a lake that I used to walk around all the time with my dog, or go hiking with my mother or with friends. And then, I had nothing to do with it. The location department found this lake, a very lake that I knew. So when Joaquin Phoenix is walking on that gravel with this mad determination, I'm like, I used to walk on that gravel. It was such a weird coincidence. And anyway, and that's like your backyard.
Well, I'll tell you, one time I was doing a run from there, from the top of Skyline Drive. I was going to run down to the lake and do 2 circuits there and back. Within the first third of a mile, big black bear
oh my God.
in the big trash dumpsters for the houses that are near the lake. And it took off when it saw me. And I had that moment of, I'm only a third of a mile in. It ran in the other direction, so I'm going to keep going and hope it's not there when I make it back. So I'm glad Joaquin Phoenix did not get encounter with a black bear at any point during the shoot.
I used to be, and what a determination to be a runner. You're like, I'm like, I so need to run that I will risk, being an outtake of that movie, Grizzly Bear or something. But oh my God, my version of that here in LA is like, I live on a dead-end street, and the skunks come out around 7 to 8 p.m. or, in dusk, and I walk my dog, and I just live in fear. And the skunks, like, they don't have good hearing, they don't have good vision, so they'll suddenly pop out, and you'll stumble upon them, and you'll get sprayed. But I'm I'm very vigilant, but we almost got sprayed last night. This skunk arched its back like a cat, was ready to turn around and fire. Luckily, we're facing it head on. I mean, and I just grabbed my dog and we ran the other way, because one time we did get sprayed a few years ago. It was in my own yard in the darkness. But one thing, there was something. Oh, I wanted to ask you, and then we could, whatever you need to do to stop recording. Sorry, we're going on. But there, around that lake at the top, were those old ruins of somebody's beautiful house and this swimming pool. I feel like it was built like in the 20s, and I always loved walking around ruins and trying to imagine what had once been. I mean, obviously. Oh,
there's the castle up at the top. Yeah. And you're right. There's a house next to that has this empty foundation beside it, the stone house. It looks like it's the remains of a pool. Yeah, I don't know. There are people living there, or at least there are cars parked there, so I don't know what the story is. But I have run straight up the about 1/10 of a mile to the ruins all the way at the top, up this ridiculously steep trail.
Yeah, I know that.
And I've regretted it immensely. I walked down the other way, the road leading there.
I would love to know the history behind those ruins. And then, down below them, there seems to be some kind of house. And then on the other peak is that weird tower, which is some kind of radio tower, right? Didn't you tell me that? Yeah,
that and the fire spotters. They operate from there, too. It's weird stuff that, we just had in the background here in northern New Jersey. You didn't realize was strange till you go somewhere else. But.
And I wrote about Skyline Drive in my novel, The Extra Man.
I've got it here, but I've never read it, which is an embarrassment, I admit. But at least I'm telling you, I'm being honest, okay?
That's fine. But if you read it, there's, I think, a passage about the family driving up Skyline Drive to look at New York in the distance. Because I think sometimes we would drive up there, or when, right at a certain turn.
Oh yeah, when you're leaving Ringwood towards Oakland, you can see all of the city spread out like that.
Yeah, if it's a clear day and it like looks literally like Oz, and the 30 miles away, 40 miles, whatever it is. So
about 30, but that was during the pandemic. That was my thing. There was 14 months where anytime I went over the mountain, I would see the city and think to myself, I guess I'm going to be back there someday. But I don't know when that day is going to be, but the city is right there.
And I don't know if you had that in New Jersey. Certainly at the beginning of the pandemic, we had it here in LA, where there was so much less air pollution that someone was like, oh my God, look at all these mountains, which you only might, but it was like, a lot of times you see them on the clear days anyway, but then there was an extra clarity and we're like, wow, there's even more mountains. I mean, LA is ringed by mountains, and the valley is, and there was a certain beauty in the beginning of the pandemic of like, holy smokes, it was just so gorgeous. So I just wonder too, in the beginning, when there was less auto pollution, that you really could see the
out
city.
Here, it wasn't as big, but you remember growing up here, it wasn't as bad. The amount of light pollution isn't as bad in, Ringwood, Oakland area, as opposed to being in New York itself.
Well, I'm talking about smog during the day.
Yeah, for you guys, it's for what you could see from here, it's all Ringwood, so everything is hills and mountains anyway. But we get to see everything off in the distance, and, way off, 30 miles away is the greatest city in the world. So, Anyway, we'll get together. You'll see.
Okay. Well, I enjoy your newsletters and hearing your voice through them. So anyway, well, thank you for having me on again.
Thanks for coming on. I appreciate it.
And if anyone out there was annoyed by me talking about Buddhism, I apologize. I'm learning. I'm trying. That's my version of you saying you're a failure at writing.
So you're transforming suffering, so that's a good thing. And that was Jonathan Ames. His new novel, The Wheel of Doll, is a blast. Go get that and the first book in the Happy Doll series, A Man Named Doll, from Mulholland Books. And Doll is D-O-L-L, which is part of the whole joke of his name being Happy Doll. I hope I got across just how much fun these books are, but also how Jonathan manages to use the parameters of the hard-boiled crime novel to deliver some surprises and get us thinking about some of the larger aspects of life. We'll put it that way. Now, Jonathan does not seem to have a website or a social media presence, and as we all know, that's a lot healthier way to live. I would quit mine, but, I need to promote the podcast somehow and find new guests, and I guess the podcast is my karma. But anyway, about the podcast, you can support it by telling other people about it. Tell them there's this guy out there putting up these great conversations with creative people every week. You can also help the show out by telling me what you like and don't like about it, who you'd like to hear me record with, what movie, TV show, book, piece of music, theater, art exhibition, etc. you think I should turn listeners on to. You can do that by sending me a postcard. I love postcards, a letter, email, DM, or by leaving a message on my Google Voice number, which is 973-869-9659. That goes directly to voicemail, so you don't have to worry about getting stuck in an awkward conversation with me. And messages can be up to 3 minutes long. So if you go longer than that, it'll cut you off, call back, and leave more message. And let me know if you do leave a message, if it's okay to include your message in an upcoming episode of the show. You might say something that would be really neat for our listeners to hear, but I would never put that sort of thing in a show without the speaker's permission. So let me know. Now, if you've got money to spare, don't give it to me. My day job treats me fine. My expenses are pretty minimal for the show. I'd really hope that you would help individuals or institutions in need instead. You can find people through GoFundMe, Patreon, Kickstarter, Topato.go, Crowdfunder, and other crowdfunding platforms. If you're looking for somewhere to start with institutions or foundations, I give to my local food bank, occasionally give to the Poor People's Campaign. I make targeted election contributions. Freedom funds are a great way to start. Planned Parenthood, Women's Choice, and abortion funds can use your support right now. There are a lot of things you can do to help work towards a better world, so I hope you will. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. Now, you've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.